What if the voice controlling the silos belongs to a man we are watching in the past? That sounds ridiculous until you put Daniel Keane next to the algorithm and look at what Season 3 has actually shown us. Daniel is living in 2049. He is a congressman who gets pulled into the mystery surrounding the silos before they are even built. He becomes connected to Per Stenson and Senator Thurman, learns what they are planning, and gets close enough to the project that he could potentially understand its purpose from the beginning. Then we have the voice. Centuries later, that voice knows exactly how the silos work. It knows about Safeguard. It monitors people inside Silo 18. It tracks biological information. It can manipulate decisions without revealing who is actually speaking. And it has a strangely personal way of dealing with people. The show has never clearly identified the person behind that voice. Even fan discussions have pointed out that the voice has not been given a normal on-screen identity, while theories about Daniel have been circulating since the early Season 3 episodes. So the question becomes much more interesting. Could Daniel become the algorithm? And if he does, what would have to happen to him? The biggest problem with this theory is time. Daniel Keane is a man from the before times. The algorithm operates centuries later. Unless the show is hiding something enormous, Daniel cannot simply walk into Silo 1 and spend hundreds of years giving orders. That means the theory needs another mechanism. And Season 3 has already given us one: memory. Charlotte's storyline matters here. Daniel's sister returns from the Iran mission with her memories damaged. The season has spent a surprising amount of time showing us that memory can be manipulated, suppressed, damaged, and potentially restored. That makes the idea of transferring a person's mind, personality, or memories into some future system much less absurd within the show's rules. We have already seen the story connect human consciousness with technology in ways that would have seemed impossible earlier in the series. And Daniel has another connection that matters even more. He is present at the creation of the Silo Project. By episode 8, the Before Time storyline has revealed that the Underground Project is tied directly to the threat of dangerous nanotechnology. Daniel and Helen learn that dozens of silos are being prepared as protection against a civilization-ending catastrophe. That puts Daniel much closer to the origin of the system than almost anyone we have seen. He isn't some random person from the past. He is one of the people who actually witnessed the decisions that created this world. And that creates a very strange possibility. Maybe Daniel was never meant to live inside the silos as an ordinary resident. Maybe the people building them needed someone who understood the original plan. Someone who understood why humanity had to be isolated. Someone who knew what the system was supposed to protect. Someone who could make decisions when the people inside the silos no longer remembered why they were there. That person could have been Daniel. Now listen to the algorithm's behavior. It does not behave like a simple security program. It argues with Camille. It tests her. It studies her reactions. It appears to monitor her physical condition, including biological information. It gives orders, but it also seems to understand human psychology. Camille can challenge it. She can deceive it. She can manipulate information. And the algorithm responds to her as if it understands what she is trying to do. That has caused some viewers to question whether the entity is actually an AI at all. The show has never explicitly established that the voice is artificial intelligence, and fan discussions have repeatedly pointed out that algorithm may simply be the label viewers inherited from the subtitles. That distinction matters, because if the algorithm is actually a human consciousness operating through a computer system, then the strange personality suddenly makes more sense. And Daniel is an interesting candidate because of the way he thinks. Look at his role in the Before Times. Daniel isn't a scientist sitting in a laboratory. He is a political figure. He understands people, institutions, public messaging, and the compromises required to get enormous projects approved. That is exactly the kind of knowledge and intelligence controlling a civilization would need. The algorithm doesn't merely maintain machinery. It controls information. It decides who gets to know what. It determines when people become threats. It knows when to pressure someone and when to withhold information. That sounds remarkably close to the kind of power Daniel has been surrounded by his entire life. And there is another detail I think deserves more attention. The algorithm's voice has become one of the show's biggest mysteries, partly because it sounds human enough for viewers to keep searching for a person behind it. Fan discussions have specifically compared it with Daniel's voice, while others have proposed Victor Krunkovich as a stronger match. There is still no confirmed answer, so we shouldn't treat the voice resemblance as proof, but we can treat it as a clue, because if the production wanted the voice to be completely anonymous, they had an easy option: They could make it sound unmistakably synthetic. Instead, we have a voice that has enough human character for viewers to recognize possible similarities. That becomes even more interesting when you compare Daniel's story with the algorithm's personality. Daniel is repeatedly forced to confront the morality of the Silo Project. He learns that people may be deliberately isolated for generations. He learns that the people making these decisions believe the sacrifice is necessary, and he has to decide how much he is willing to accept in the name of survival. The algorithm lives by that same logic. It is willing to erase memories. It is willing to kill people. It is willing to manipulate an entire population. It is willing to sacrifice individuals when it calculates that the larger system requires it. That could be the philosophy Daniel eventually adopts. Or it could be something worse. Maybe the algorithm was created using Daniel's personality as its model. In that version of the theory, Daniel doesn't have to physically survive for centuries. His memories could be recorded. His personality could be copied. His voice could be preserved. His decision-making patterns could become the foundation of the system. The algorithm would then be Daniel without being Daniel. And that would explain why the voice can feel human while behaving like a machine. There is another possibility, though. Daniel could actually become part of the system himself. If the Silo Project eventually develops technology capable of preserving consciousness, Daniel could be placed into some form of long-term storage. Maybe his body dies. Maybe his memories survive. Maybe his mind becomes connected to the central computer infrastructure. And over centuries, the man becomes the voice. That would make the algorithm's authority much more personal. It wouldn't simply be following the founder's instructions. It would be one of the founders still making decisions. And that brings us to Silo 1. Because if Daniel is the algorithm, Silo 1 becomes extremely important. Bernard eventually realizes that Silo 18 is not operating independently. There is a higher authority controlling what happens. The people in Silo 18 think they are following their own rules, but the deeper system has always been watching. That means the real question isn't just who is speaking. It is who has been speaking for how long. If Daniel created the system, he could have been there from the beginning. If his consciousness was preserved, he could have watched generation after generation grow up underground. And if he eventually became the algorithm, then the voice controlling Silo 18 could be carrying the beliefs of the same man who helped decide that the silos were necessary. That would make the algorithm's obsession with survival much easier to understand, because Daniel would have lived through the moment when humanity decided that survival required sacrificing freedom. But there is a problem with Daniel being the voice, a big one. The algorithm appears to know things Daniel could never have known in 2049. It understands the silos as a functioning network. It knows the details of Safeguard. It monitors events occurring centuries after Daniel's lifetime. So if Daniel is involved, something must have happened to give him access to all that information. And this is where the theory becomes less about Daniel survived and more about Daniel became the blueprint. That version fits the evidence better. Imagine the people building the silos creating an intelligence based on one of their own decision makers. They wouldn't need to preserve every memory. They would need the important ones. Why the silos exist, what the outside threat is, what Safeguard is for, how the population should be controlled, what happens if people discover the truth. The system could then continue making decisions according to Daniel's original reasoning. Over time, the human identity could disappear. The voice would remain. And the people inside the silos would eventually call that voice the algorithm. There is a fascinating clue in how the algorithm handles mistakes. In Season 3, the algorithm incorrectly concludes that Lucas and Patrick have been neutralized. They survive. That mistake matters because it shows the entity does not possess perfect knowledge. An all-knowing computer should have a very hard time explaining that. A human operator with incomplete information makes much more sense. And a human-derived intelligence with limited access to certain silos makes even more sense. This could explain why the algorithm sometimes seems several steps ahead of everyone, while at other moments it has to react to new information. It isn't omniscient. It has surveillance. It has data. It has predictive systems. But it can still be wrong. That is exactly what we would expect from a system built around a human mind. There is another clue in the way Camille interacts with it. The algorithm doesn't simply issue commands and disappear. It engages with her psychologically. That is important because the whole silo system depends on understanding human behavior. The people in charge have always needed to know who might rebel, who might ask questions, who might become dangerous, and who can be manipulated. If Daniel's consciousness or personality became part of the system, his political instincts could be exactly what the algorithm uses. And Daniel has spent the entire Before Time storyline learning that information is power. That makes his connection to the algorithm feel almost too neat. But there is a second candidate we have to take seriously, Viktor Krinkovich. Some viewers have argued that the algorithm sounds more like Krinkovich than Daniel, and the theory has gained attention because Krinkovich's work is connected to the technology surrounding memory and human experimentation. That theory may actually solve some problems that Daniel's theory creates. If the algorithm originated from a scientist involved in the technology, then its knowledge of biology, memory, and human behavior would be easier to explain. And the voice's clinical way of talking could fit that interpretation. Daniel's strongest connection is political and historical. Krenkovich's strongest connection would be technological. So there are really two different versions of the mystery. One asks whether the algorithm was built around the person who understood why the silos were created. The other asks whether it was built around the person who understood how the technology worked. And the show could be setting up a combination of both. Daniel could provide the personality. Krenkovich could provide the technology. That would create an algorithm that is technically artificial while still carrying a human identity. And there is one more reason I think Daniel remains a strong possibility. The show has spent season 3 cutting between Daniel's past and Juliet's present. That structure is doing more than explaining where the silos came from. It is showing us the people who made the decisions that created the world Juliet inherited. Daniel has been placed at the center of that historical storyline for a reason. He is the character who lets us watch the Silo Project develop from a political idea into a physical reality. By episode 8, Daniel and Helen have already been brought close enough to the project to understand that Stenson and Thurman are building something enormous to protect humanity from nanotechnology. So if Daniel eventually becomes the algorithm, the show would have created a direct line between the man who watched the silos being built and the intelligence that controls them centuries later. That would be a very Silo-style reveal. The past would explain the voice would explain the present. And Daniel's decisions would become the reason people like Juliet are still trapped underground hundreds of years later. There is also a darker interpretation. Maybe Daniel didn't choose to become the algorithm. Maybe the people behind the Silo Project chose him. They could have discovered that human decision-making was too unreliable to leave the silos without supervision. So they created a permanent administrator, a mind that could never retire, a mind that could never rebel, a mind that could never walk away. If that happened, Daniel's greatest contribution to the Silo Project might have been his own identity. He could have been preserved because the system needed someone who understood the original mission. Then the tragedy becomes obvious. Daniel would have helped build the prison and eventually become one of its prisoners. He would spend centuries enforcing a decision he made when the world was ending, and every generation would inherit the consequences. That also gives the algorithm's behavior toward Juliet a different meaning. Why is Juliet such a problem? Because she keeps doing something the system cannot tolerate. She discovers information that was supposed to remain buried. She survives situations that should have killed her. She finds weaknesses in Safeguard. She moves between silos. And most importantly, she keeps proving that the system's assumptions can be wrong. The algorithm has already made a major mistake with Lucas and Patrick. Juliet could be the person who exposes the much bigger mistake, the belief that humanity can only survive through permanent control. And if the voice really is Daniel, that would make their conflict deeply personal, even though Juliet has never met the man. She would be fighting the decision of someone who lived centuries before her. There is still one major piece missing. We don't know how a human consciousness could survive long enough to become the algorithm. The show hasn't confirmed that technology exists. We also don't have confirmation that Daniel is the voice, and the voice resemblance alone is nowhere near enough. So I wouldn't call this solved, but I do think Daniel is more interesting as the identity behind the algorithm than simply as another character in the flashbacks. Because the season has placed him exactly where you would want the future creator of the system to be. At the beginning. Watching the plan take shape, learning why humanity needs the silos, and making decisions about whether that plan is morally acceptable. The strongest version of this theory isn't that Daniel somehow sits in a chair for hundreds of years and talks through a speaker. It is that the system preserves something of Daniel, his voice, his memories, his personality, his decisions, maybe even his consciousness. And by the time Juliet hears that voice, she isn't talking to a machine that happens to sound human. She could be talking to the final surviving piece of one of the men who helped create her entire world. That would also explain why the algorithm feels so strangely personal. It understands survival because Daniel learned what survival costs. It understands control because Daniel watched the Silo Project become a system of control. And it understands the original purpose of the silos because Daniel was there when that purpose was decided. For now, there is another candidate sitting in the shadows, and Krunkovich may turn out to be the answer. But Daniel has one advantage the other theories don't. The story has already spent an entire season making us watch him move toward the origin of the silos. If the voice eventually turns out to be Daniel, all those flashbacks suddenly become part of the same mystery. We wouldn't just be watching the past. We would be watching the creation of the voice Juliet has been fighting all along.